So, first item on the list of the 5 common jig fishing mistakes that most anglers make is that most guys, when they start picking up a jig, are not fishing it around a specific target. What I mean by that is that they're not intentionally taking that jig and throwing it at an object or a spot in the middle of the lake. And I want to explain that a little bit just to kind of give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about. And I have Google Earth pulled up here, and I just want to show you some areas on the lake that actually that's drawn down about 15 feet. It's a little lake by my house, or that I used to fish by my house, that is loaded with big fish. And I've caught probably about 2,000 jig fish on this lake, give or take, over about 7 or 8 years. And there's a ton of cool things you can see with this lake drawn down. If we take a look kind of in this area, for example, we have this really nice rocky ridge that sticks out. And again, if you take the lake up, that ridge is normally completely underwater. But when we take the lake down, you can see it's here. So usually you can fish this. There's like 10 foot of water on this. But right now, the lake's down, just to give you guys an example. And this is a great example of something that I would be throwing a jig on. It's this random like pond levee that has some rock on it and it's sitting off the bank. Another great example is this little brush pile right here that's sticking out in the middle of the lake. Or maybe this old road where you can see there's a little road with a blowout right there. That's where I'd be fishing. But the key with all of this is that all of the areas I'm fishing a jig are going to be small, little areas like this right here, or maybe that brush pile right here, or maybe the tip of that pond levee. And these are all offshore areas, guys, but you can apply the same thing. For example, if you look up here when the lake is high, here's an isolated grouping of trees that are a little bit bigger and off the bank. That might be the area I'm picking to fish the jig in. Either way, the areas I'm focusing on are areas that are maybe 20 to 30 feet in a circle. So you're going to be basically doing like a kind of a 20-foot square area, something like that, where I'm going to be throwing that jig. And I'm going to be focusing on just fishing that jig in that one specific spot. I think a lot of guys get messed up when they're trying to fish jigs because they try to fish them like they do a lot of other baits that maybe are more effective for them. Spinner baits, crank baits, things like that. And they're just randomly throwing them down the bank. And that even works like a Texas ray worm and stuff like that. You can just kind of cast them down the bank and sometimes pick up a fish. But with a jig, the number one key to getting bit is you have to be throwing that jig on a very specific target. And I'm never just going down the bank just fishing a jig, hardly ever. It's always on a very specific targeted spot, whether it's offshore or up shallow. Another example I'll pull up is over here on Beaver Lake, which is a rock transition that I fish sometimes in the winter and in the spring. Here, if we go scroll into this area, you can see that there's a really nice transition from this steep bluff wall to this pea gravel bank over here, and there's some chunk rock in between. And this transition from the steep bluff to that chunk rock, or to the pea gravel with the chunk rock in between, that's maybe no more than a 20-yard stretch of bank. And that's what I'm going to be fishing my jig on. A very small section. I'm not just going to pick up the jig, start in the mouth of this creek, and fish the entire creek. One, that's very inefficient because you have to fish a jig slow, which we'll get into in a little bit, to be effective. But at the same time, these key little stretches are where a lot of the fish are going to be holding as well. So usually a jig is a bait that you throw once you have a good feeling that the fish are in a certain spot. It's not a bait to cover water, just go out to just go fish with. It's a bait that once you've dialed in where the fish are, you actually use it to maximize that area, catch more fish out of that area. And that's something I think a lot of guys struggle with in general, is just finding a good area to catch fish. And that's why jigs are a little bit more advanced in terms of skill needed to actually fish them, is because you have to have a good understanding of where those fish are and where these 20-yard stretches or 20-foot square areas are the fish are holding on. And so that's kind of what I'm always looking for when I want to fish a specific spot with a jig. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially when you're fishing offshore. For me, let me share my screen here. I'll talk a little bit about the shallow jig that I do, most of my fishing around. Let's see. You see my Google Earth there, Johnny?
Got it pulled up.
Okay. Now, The thing that I'm looking for, and we're talking again about specific, where you're just not randomly throwing a jig everywhere. When you're talking about fishing shallow cover, and here's a great example of a typical Highland reservoir. This is Stockton Lake, but this lake is set up very similar to almost any man-made reservoir that has, a combination of different types of cover in it. Right here, you got a flat bank with a lot of laydown wood, and here back in the creek, you got some buck brushes that they can be in anywhere between 6 inches to 5 feet of water, depending upon the level of the lake. But what you have when you're talking about jig fishing on specific spots, shallow cover, you have spots within spots. So, say for example, on this Buckbrush Island right here, let's just say the water, there's 3 foot of water in the bushes. When you come up to one of these bushes here, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make that don't have a lot of fishing experience, specifically with a jig, is they don't really know where to key in on around like a bush right here. And there's going to be spots within that spot that you need to put that jig in. And most of the time, it's going to be darker areas. It's going to be areas of the bush that is a little bit more complex, but it's going to be an area that's large enough for a fish to be able to set in there comfortably. It's not like you want to flip in a super, super tight spot. You want to flip into a spot that's like as big as maybe a coffee can lid or something like that. And based upon how the direction of the sun or the wind is going to determine how that fish is positioned around that bush. And a lot of times, each one of these bushes is different. It's set up different. The light's hitting a little bit different. The angle, the water depth's a little bit different of it. There's areas within that specific piece of cover that you really want to target with that jig. And it's the same if you move over and start fishing the isolated laydowns. There's going to be specific spots that you want to put that jig in. It's not like you just want to fan cast it everywhere around the laydown or, in the open areas around it. There's going to be a part of that laydown that's a little, maybe throwing some shade off. There'll be one part of that laydown that maybe has got a little bit of a root wad on it that creates a little bit more of a complex piece of cover. And that's where you want to put that jig at, those high percentage areas, because when you're flipping down a bank like this that has a lot of cover, you got to be able to balance out the gist of fishing thoroughly, yet covering water. So if you just fished every single square inch of every corner of the laydown here, it'd take you forever to cover any water. But by knowing where to put that jig at in those high percentage areas on shallow cover, it's really going to maximize your time on the water and the number of bites you get versus the time you fish it.
For sure. And another thing, too, in that image, Randy, if you can pull up like an isolated laydown, that's always something that's key whenever you're fishing up shallower. If you can find an isolated target that's away from any other object, that's always going to be very important. Basically, what Randy you talked about is like you want to find something that's either really gnarly, like the thickest cover among all of the other covers. So if everything's kind of just 1 or 2 branches, and then you come up with a tree that has 30 branches, that's going to be better. And then like what Randy has pulled up there.
Yeah, like right here, you've got this little isolated laydown right here out away from everything. This would be a high percentage area that you could put that jig in, fish thoroughly around.
And a lot of times when I'm jig fishing, Randy, and I'm sure it's the same for you, I don't get bit on every single one of these high percentage areas. What you have to do is throw your jig in a lot of those areas. And the key is that when you're going through, whether it's on the bank or whether it's offshore, you want to make sure that that jig is in that productive zone the majority of the time you're throwing it. Do you want to be in that gnarliest cover, the isolated cover, the offshore sweet spots I was showing earlier? And if that bait isn't in those zones most of the time you're fishing, you're not going to catch that many fish in a jig, because on average, a jig is not going to generate 30, 40 bites a day. Usually it's like a 5 to 10 bite a day sort of bait, even when you're fishing in the most high percentage areas. But it's going to generate those bigger bites. So your 5 fish on a jig are in a way 2 to 5, maybe 6 pounds heavier than any other bait, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and we'll cover that here a little bit later in the podcast. But like I said, when you're talking about flipping down through here a jig on all this cover here, there's a tremendous amount of variables involved in it that we're going to cover a little bit later. So not only do you have to worry about positioning and putting that jig into the sweet spot, everything else has to line up perfectly around that to get that bite too. We've literally got dozens of variables that can possibly exist around throwing a jig on this piece of wood right here that we'll talk about here in a second.